All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this mini summit about frequent releases. And before we look at some examples, I just want to highlight, why this is so important. And basically three reasons. So to begin with, many of the most successful companies today are software as a service companies, SaaS companies. It can include all kinds of software products, games, but also many of the big enterprises are in practice becoming SaaS companies as well, as they are changing their offers to become kind of more like a service offering. And when you are a software as a service business, you will be releasing very frequently. So to be able to do this in a smooth way, having the ways of working that really supports releasing often is going to be very valuable. Secondly, for the teams, it's way less stressful if you have good practices around releasing often. Each release event is not going to be as of a big thing that everyone is kind of ramping up for. Instead, this is something that happens all the time. And if you, for example, are using a release train, it's a very undramatic event of releasing. Finally, if you want to have a large amount of autonomy in your organization with your teams, it's going to be important also with basically a system for how to do this. Of course, releasing often has a lot to do with IT infrastructure around DevOps. So there's that dimension to it, but it's also about the ways of working for this that we're going to talk a lot about today. And the reason you want to have this autonomy with the teams is firstly that is the key to achieve agility throughout your whole organization. So you can very quickly adapt to whatever change which is happening, which is going to give you a competitive advantage in the market. And secondly, now when people are starting to go into a post-COVID kind of workplace scenario, most organizations are moving into a bit of a hybrid organization where people will be working from anywhere at the large amount of the time. And this also requires a very high level of autonomy for this kind of organization to work in a practical way. So with that said, over to some practical examples.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, yeah, so let's just jump right in here. I'm going to share my screen. And first, we're going to start with some modern ways of doing release planning, release management, and tracking the progress towards those releases, in which Favro empowers teams to do, as Patrick said, across the entire organization. So it's not just about development teams creating capabilities and features. It's also, of course, about working with DevOps. It's also, of course, now working with maybe in tandem with marketing. If you need to promote these upcoming new features, everybody needs to be in sync in these very fast-moving software as a service type companies, organizations. So the first example that I'm going to show you is release tagging and release boards. So the way this works is, I'm going to give myself a little more space here, is you simply are using the power of tagging in Favro in these hierarchical backlogs, as you can see here, driven by priority, where we're going to be creating our release plan with simple release tags. And as we're building that release plan, those features, those capabilities, those user stories, whatever terminology you use, are going to start showing up here over on the right automatically on this release board. There's a couple of other automations that are going to be firing off behind the scenes that I'm going to show you as well. So say, for example, this enhanced performance user story is tagged to release 1, for example. You can see that automatically pops up here on this aggregate release planning board. So you can see everything that's coming in release 1, release 2, etc. If I tag this one to release 2, it's going to do the same thing and pop up over here in this release 2 column. There's multiple different ways to visualize the board. I could switch this to a timeline, maybe turn it into a visual timeline-based roadmap directly on the fly. So now also behind the scenes, while I'm doing this release planning per release through automations in Favro, it's also creating what we call a release burn down. So you can see here, enhanced performance automatically is also added to the not started phase of this release 1 burn down, because it's all these cards across multiple teams, right? This could be multiple development teams, a DevOps team, maybe a marketing team, so on and so forth. Everybody that needs to be involved and contribute towards this release 1 for this fictional company here. So we have this in place, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment. But now we want to actually start assigning these features, these user stories out to the teams. So another nice feature in Favro is the ability to have multiple team boards in a single collection at the same time. And I'm showing that off here. I have this development team 1 sprint board, this development team Kanban board coming from other collections. So this is coming from team 1's collection. This is coming from team's 2 collection. I've even brought in a board from a marketing team showing that I could be assigning work, because the cards can exist in multiple places in Favro across these teams, maybe even sharing the same card. So if I take, for example, that same feature, enhanced performance, and I'm going to actually open up a development team sprint board here and take that and move it over here. And maybe marketing also needs to be aware of this too. They're doing a marketing campaign around this. I could even drag that same card over here, and you might have different tasks list on the card itself saying what team is supposed to do what. Now, this card, remember, also exists up here in this release burn down. So as the team actually makes progress on this particular feature or user story, they're going to pull it to in development. And you can see, thanks to, again, automations in Favro, it automatically moved that enhanced performance user story from not started to in progress on this aggregate board of cards from multiple teams. So this is tracking not just the progress of a single team's work towards targeting towards this release, but multiple teams in aggregate, which is super important, because what you can do, so say, for example, this moves at the team level to done. You can see it automatically tagged it as done. It also moved it to the ready for release column up here on this release burn down board. So now, again, across multiple teams, you're automatically tracking that progress. And by switching this to then a burn down board, this becomes a release burn down, where you can see across all of your teams, how are you tracking towards completion to all the work that you targeted or tagged to this particular release. Behind the scenes, across all those teams, it's tracking automatically for you the teams velocity and giving you this nice dotted line prediction out into the future, saying, oh yeah, we actually targeted this date, right, for this release. But as far as our current velocities are telling us across that teams of teams, it looks like we're actually going to come in a little bit early. So maybe we could potentially deliver more in this release, depending on how you work. So that is the first example of how to handle release planning and release management in Favro. I also just wanted to call out that, as well as maybe having a marketing teams board in here when you're doing maybe release planning across teams of teams, you could quickly bring in another teams board from even another collection. So say maybe DevOps, search for it, bring in their current sprint board, and you could do that same thing where you're adding cards from the backlog, maybe even across teams, to the DevOps teams board. So they're also included in this release tagging and burn down process. So now to a second example of how teams that we've seen use Favro for modern release planning is user story mapping, or otherwise sometimes called user experience maps or user journeys, lots of different names, but it's all essentially the same thing. You're taking a backlog full of relatively flat of course, you can have a hierarchy in Favro, as you see here, breaking themes down into epics, then breaking those epics down into user stories and having everything roll up, like you see the estimates are doing here. But this doesn't really give you perspective as to, well, what's the user experience going to be? How is a user going to experience this fictional, for example, online reservation app? And to do that, it's a very kind of simple but elegant solution called the user story map. So you basically take that expected user journey, flow it out onto a board like this. So a user starts using your app. The very first thing they're going to want to do is search for a restaurant. Maybe it's based on their current location, how much they want to spend, what type of food they want to eat, so on and so forth. So that would be the filtering, for example. And then the next thing they're going to do is when they find a restaurant that they actually are interested in, they're going to click on it. It'll open up a description, maybe some reviews, photos, price range, so on and so forth. Once they actually narrow it down to the restaurant where they actually want to eat, they can make the reservation directly in line in this app, right? So everybody's used an app like this. And it's that expected user journey through your application or tool. So in this first pass, what you're doing is you're simply taking not user stories, but more likely epics broken down from all of these themes and saying, what are the epics, the highest priority epics that we need to have for restaurant search, okay? And maybe you're dragging in filtering, you're dragging in sorting, because the cards can exist in multiple places at all levels. I just simply took filtering, for example, and dragged it over here. And we can say, oh, actually, well, maybe sorting or filtering is the most important thing, and maybe stack rank that up to the top. And then from a release plan perspective, once you get kind of your high level user story map at the epic level set up, you can then expand these, say maybe filtering to those actual user stories. And based on the highest priority user stories, start to build out an actual release plan, but still using this user story mapping type mentality. So now we're actually going to build maybe our MVP, minimum viable product, release 1, whatever you want to call it. And now instead of taking those epics, we're now taking down at a lower level at the user story level and dragging and dropping in filter by food type. From a search perspective, maybe we're pulling in advanced results map out of this epic here. And this is all linked via relations back to that user story map board. So if I open it up, you can even see those relations on the card. I can see how this is flowing across multiple boards, which is very nice. And the idea is that eventually you start to build out, based on the expected user journey, you start to build out not only your MVP, as you see here, but you can start to do future release planning and the same concept. What are the next highest priority things per category here, or per kind of that journey map that we should add to the app after the MVP, taking into consideration what we learned after releasing the MVP, for example, all the way through maybe to release 3, so on and so forth. And the other thing that I want to call out while we're here is that because you can have those cards in multiple places at the same time, not only can these user stories live in this user story map / release plan, but they can also live in a team board. So say, for example, we take this one that's not started and we want to commit this to a team. I need to actually open up that team board. We can take that and drag and drop it down to their sprint backlog, so to say, from their sprint planning. So the cards in multiple places, super nice. It started in a backlog. It moved on to that user story map, and now it's actually on a team board to actually get that work done. So that is the second example. The third example that I want to show you, and this is something that Patrick called out in the introduction, if you're working in kind of a very flow-based way, continuous flow, continuous delivery, a lot of teams like to use this concept of a release train. So they are basically priority driven. So what gets worked on first is always priority driven at the team level. But your release is based on a regular cadence. So in this example, I'm using a weekly cadence, and a lot of teams actually release a lot more often than weekly. But for the sake of example, you can create this release train board. And as teams are actually finishing those increments of value, these user stories in this particular example, it's going to say, okay, for release for week 3, what's done? And if we're only going to release the stuff that's actually finished, obviously, right? So how this is going to work in practice is the teams might take a new user story in their sprint planning or whatnot and drag that onto their team level board like this. And maybe you have another team. Again, you can commit cards to multiple teams from the same backlog like this. They're working maybe a slightly different way. And we'll say, okay, let's start to pull this from left to right through the development process. So in development, QA, as soon as this browse products makes it to ready for release, saying they're done with this, it's been through quick QA, this increment of value is now ready for release. It fired off an automation there. And the same thing could be happening for this other team, right? In the same collection. And that automatically added that same card, browse products, as soon as it was dragged into and tagged as ready for release, up to the release train. So now a release manager is able to say, oh, great, release products is now ready for release. Maybe they have to do some of their testing. Maybe there's some DevOps testing that needs to happen before it can be released to production. Maybe they also have to determine, is this something that should be toggled on to the user, right? Because when you work on this way, you might have things that are ready that are dependent on other user stories, maybe being even worked on by other teams before that kind of aggregate piece of functionality actually makes sense to the end user. So a lot of teams will actually release something, but toggle the feature off so that they can test that feature in a production environment, but the end users aren't able to see it or access it. So maybe you have something like this. You can see everything that's toggled off, everything that's toggled on. And here, automatically, you're going to see all the user stories, all the features that are ready for this week 3 release. As soon as those things are actually released, you can do this through an automation too, or manually, just saying, okay, these are the things from week to week to week that actually got released and actually get toggled on and off. So a very nice, as Patrick said, non-event, because it's just happening organically, naturally, as the teams are finishing the highest priority features out of their backlogs. Okay, so those are 3 examples of how to do modern release planning in Favro. Now we're going to move on to how would we do roadmaps, those release roadmaps in Favro at all levels. So I'm going to switch over here, and we're going to start at the top with the company dashboard. And one of the things you're going to notice again right away is the ability to have multiple roadmaps, multiple team boards, all in a single screen collection. This breaks through those silos. You don't spend a lot of time jumping back and forth between multiple projects or team views to see the individual boards. You can see them all in one place, including the roadmaps. So you might have a portfolio Kanban like this, driving your high-level strategic initiatives, actually driving the business. And because of the power of being able to have multiple views of the same board, we can switch this from a Kanban to a timeline view. And this essentially now becomes your portfolio roadmap. This is your strategic roadmap of over time, how are we driving this organization, the SaaS company in this case. These can be linked down. We don't have time to cover it in this particular mini summit, but these can be linked down to the actual teams doing the work on each one of these initiatives, so you can see the progress and drill down to it from here. Now, we also have in the same board maybe a product or program level roadmap, right? Drilling down into this actual product. What are the features that are going to be released over time or plan to be released over time? Also, maybe a marketing roadmap like this. What are the campaigns? What are the US launch, the European launch? When are we doing the social media blitz? So on and so forth, spread over time. And to create these, it's as easy as just clicking here, maybe adding a new event like this, dragging and dropping it, maybe changing the color like this. You can even take, maybe we want to have some sort of a sales initiative on here on this marketing board. We could even drag from another team's board up to this roadmap to visualize their work on a timeline like this. So you can see how easy it is to build these roadmaps, even across multiple teams. And of course, these also exist not only here in this company dashboard, but for example, this marketing roadmap also exists primarily in a marketing team collection and also a marketing director dashboard, aggregating maybe multiple marketing teams. You can see that this product roadmap here exists on a product dashboard and also a development teams collection. And I can quickly drill down into it and see it from their perspective, maybe in line with their current sprint like this. So that's a quick example of how to create roadmaps at all levels in your organization using Favro. Now, the last thing that I'd like to cover is often when, as Patrick mentioned, often when you're in a startup situation or a SaaS company, even large enterprises, they're working with lots of external partners. It could be external development, outsourcing, QA, whatever the case may be. So to bring them closer into the process, I have an example here of a marketing team working with an external creative agency. So there's this external creative agency collection. They may be using Favro's power of external members or maybe even guest accounts, so they can only see specifically their work, the deliverables that they need to create. But this same board can also exist in a marketing director's dashboard. So he's able to see and drive maybe from an overall master marketing backlog, both the external teams work with that same drag and drop. What should they work on next? And also internal teams doing the same thing, dragging and dropping, maybe committing those cards from the marketing backlog to both internal teams and external teams. Well, the external team is again only seeing their very specific work of the cards that were actually committed to them. So that's a kind of an example of working with externals, tying them closer into your development processes and also into your roadmap processes and also into your release processes, because obviously the same work, the same way that you track internal teams and their progress towards releases can be tracked for your external teams as well. So you're really trying to get that single source of truth, breaking through those silos, even bringing in external teams and their work closer to your release plans and processes. Now, the last example that I want to show you is it's also important in a SaaS type organization to keep your customers in the loop, right? They're a partner too. They're probably your most important partner. So we have, Favro has a customer called Phoenix Labs. They have a games as a service called Dauntless, and that's played at its peak by 25 million unique players. And they actually use what's called a Favro public collection to share their roadmap, their release plan essentially, with their players, with their customers. So if you come to this Dauntless website and you go to news and you go to roadmap, it actually takes you to this Favro public collection, which they're calling their Dauntless Community Hub and Roadmap. And you can see here in a very nice visual way, all of the planned features, new art assets, content drops, everything that's coming for their player base, right? And you can click on any card and get details as to what this new feature is or this new event, whatever the case may be, to build excitement, but also maybe even garner feedback from your players. Is this what they're looking for? Is this sound fun to them ahead before things are even released? Right, getting that very fast feedback from your customers, which is of course all important in a fast-moving SaaS or games as a service type organization. So there you have it. We've covered 3 different modern release planning and tracking strategies, management strategies. We've also covered road mapping in Favro, and we've also covered working with externals, including even your customers in Favro, creating that, again, single source of truth in a single tool. So now back to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Jon. And as you can hopefully see here, there's a lot of various different tools that you can really replace with using Favro in this case, and that is definitely helpful as well. If you have any questions whatsoever around this, or you want to help setting this up, just ping our team. We're super happy to help you with these kind of things. Thank you so much for tuning in, and see you in the next mini summit.
Thank you. Goodbye.